Yeah, that's it. We are resuming. We have a great session now too. We have Gilberto Gomes and Marcelo Fischborn. I think this is a great meeting between generations. Sometimes people ask me, were you the first person we've worked with philosophy of neuroscience, experimental philosophy in Brazil? I say, no, no way. It's Gilberto Gomes. When I was still, a master's student, I was already reading Gilberto articles to Conscious and Cognition and Journal of Consciousness Studies. The Libet replies to him. So he is the real pioneer of our group, and this session is supposed to be also a homage to our dear Gilberto Gomes, who was part of my PhD committee, uh, the real pioneer in our field in Brazil. And Marcelo Fischborn, by the way, Marcelo and Gilberto Gomes have their own debate, they cite each other. And Marcelo Fischborn was the first graduate student to enroll for our first conference. And when I saw his enrollment, I was so happy. There is young blood coming and doing great work. So we have a meeting between generations here, and I'm really, really glad that we're gonna have this session with our pioneer and our new generation rising star. So now I'll just let Marco Aurelio Alves, our great fellow. He's the coordinator of the work group on philosophy of mind in the Brazilian Philosophical Association, close collaborator. He's a PhD by the University of Austin at Texas with Michael Tai supervision, and he's also a professor at the Federal University of São João del Rei. Please, Marco, take the lead.
Sure. Thank you, Gabriel, for inviting me to moderate this afternoon slash evening. It's going to go through the evening, I guess. And well, first, I just want to say that this partnership that we have developed between these two work groups, the work group on philosophy of neuroscience, and which is coordinated by Professor Gabriel Mograbi, and the work group on philosophy of mind, which I am the coordinator. It has been very fruitful, and this event itself is actually Gabriel's work and his team, but we work together on a lot of other things. And I would like just to make an announcement that in August 13th, is coming the second edition of Mind Brazil Brainstorms, which is an event that we co-organize with some other people. And it's going to be about David Papineau's new book, The Metaphysics of Sensory Experience. And it's going to be with David Papineau, Michel Montague, Kat Farkas, Francisco Pereira, Sergio Farias, and Rodrigo Gouveia. So it's going to be a roundtable to discuss this new book by David Papineau. So I invite you all to participate in this event in August. Well, concerning this roundtable, I'm glad here to announce this meeting of generations. And I want to introduce shortly first Gilberto Gomes, who is going to speak first. Gilberto Gomes is doctor in philosophy at Université Paris-Sète in France, with a dissertation about theory of consciousness. He has a master's degree at the Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro in psychology, with a thesis on the mind-body problem, BA in psychology at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, and he is a MD, a medical doctor at the State Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, Rio. He is a collaborating faculty member of the graduate program in cognition and language at the State University of Norte Fluminense. So it's a great pleasure to have Gilberto Gomes, a pioneer in the studies in philosophy of neuroscience in Brazil, and Marcelo Fischborn, the rising star, is a professor at the Farroupilha Federal Institute at Uruguaiana in Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil. He is a doctor in philosophy at the Federal University of Santa Maria, with a visiting period at the Florida State University in the US under the supervision of Alfred Mill. He wrote a dissertation on the notion of responsibility. He has an MA and a BA in philosophy, also at the Federal University of Santa Maria. So it's a great pleasure to have you both. And I'm gonna let Gilberto Gomes start his presentation, please. Oh, you are mute, Gilberto. You have to unmute yourself.
Hi, everybody. I hope everybody is doing fine. Thank you, Gabriel and Marco Aurelio, for your words of presentation. My talk will be about what kind of determination is compatible with what kind of freedom. I will share some slides with you now. Well, since my first paper on the problem of volition and free will, which was published in the Journal of Consciousness Studies in 1999, I've defined myself as a compatibilist in the sense of one who believes that freedom of the will is compatible with the causal determination of action. My views, however, were not identical to those of some other compatibilists. I also realized that if we admit certain notions of free will and of causal determination, there's simply no way of coherently advocating a compatibility between them. That's why some authors have so cogently argued against such a compatibility. It seemed thus evident to me that supporting compatibilism involved using a different concept of free will or a different concept of causal determination, or both. The outstanding young philosopher you will hear after me, Marcelo Fischborn, has honored me with a paper in which he analyzed my published views on free will and concluded that the proper classification of my position would be that of a libertarian incompatibilist. I had to agree with him that if we accept the usual definition of compatibilism, which is based on the usual definition of determinism, his conclusion is right. However, I'll argue here that determinism, as usually defined, is a myth and shouldn't be used in defining compatibilism. So I'll argue for different concepts of causal determination and compatibilism. In this talk, I'll address the following three questions. One, how causal determination should be conceived. Two, how free will should be conceived. And three, whether causal determination and free will so conceived are compatible. Let's talk about determinism first. Determinism may be defined as the claim that the state of the universe at a certain moment, in conjunction with the laws of nature, implies the state of the universe at any other moment. William James states that, according to determinism, quote, the future has no ambiguous possibilities hidden in its womb, and any other future complement than the one fixed from eternity is impossible, unquote. I believe the relation between determinism and causation can be elucidated by the concepts of necessary cause and sufficient cause. If event C is a sufficient but not necessary cause of event E, the occurrence of C implies the subsequent occurrence of E. But the occurrence of E doesn't imply the previous occurrence of C, because it might have had a different cause, here represented by D. Now, if C is a necessary but not sufficient cause of E, then it's the occurrence of E that implies the previous occurrence of C, because E never occurs without being caused by C. But the occurrence of C does not guarantee that E will occur. C might cause F instead of causing E. The third possibility is that C is a sufficient and necessary cause of E. Here both C implies the future occurrence of E, and E implies the previous occurrence of C. If we generalize this situation to all events, we get determinism. We would thus have the situation in which not only the future has no ambiguous possibilities hidden in its womb, as James says, but also the past could be entirely specified from a complete knowledge of the present. The fourth and last possibility here is that C causes E without being either a sufficient or a necessary cause of E. As an example, smoking is certainly a cause of lung cancer, but it's neither sufficient nor necessary, since some people who smoke may not have lung cancer, and some people who have never smoked may also have lung cancer. Okay? Now I'll discuss the relation between determinism and scientific knowledge. It cannot be doubted that science has succeeded in establishing laws or regularities according to which some future events are strictly determined by some previous conditions. Paradigmatically, Newton's laws of motion predict with absolute certainty the future position of moving objects and are in addition reversible, so that past positions can also be deduced with absolute certainty from present positions and motion. In other words, these laws or regularities establish necessary and sufficient causes and effects. However, there is nothing to indicate that laws such as these apply to all natural phenomena. From a probabilistic point of view, it can be said that an event that necessarily follows from previous events according to such laws or regularities has a probability of occurrence of 1, and that the occurrence of a different event under the same conditions has a probability of 0. But the fact that science has shown that there are events with these extreme probabilities of occurrence doesn't imply that all events, given the known and unknown laws of nature, must have such probabilities. To have such a belief is simply a matter of faith, not a matter of scientific fact. there is no scientific reason not to admit that other events may have probabilities of occurrence between 0 and 1. As in this example here, for example, C causing a probability of E of 0.8 and a probability of not E of 0.2. It is well known that Albert Einstein couldn't accept the probabilistic nature of quantum explanations. He hoped for a theory that could explain quantum facts in a deterministic way. He famously stated that he couldn't believe that God played at dice. Reference to God was appropriate in this sentence, showing that this was a question of faith, not one of science. Scientists are human beings, and even if they have given very important contributions to science, they also have beliefs based on faith, including faith about science. Werner Heisenberg, another giant of modern physics, categorically states in a 1955 book that quantum theory forces us to formulate these laws precisely as statistical laws and to depart radically from determinism. So that's a point of view opposite to that of Einstein. Although other authors have given different interpretations to quantum mechanics, which might be consistent with determinism, the fact remains that quantum mechanics represents a serious threat to this doctrine. If we leave the field of physics, we can see that there are other areas of scientific knowledge of which determinism is in no way a consequence. Genetics and evolution theory, for example, offer explanations of a probabilistic nature. A couple who both have blood type AB, for example, cannot have a child with blood type O, but can have children with blood types A, B, or AB with probabilities of 0.25, 0.25, and 0.5, respectively. Evolution theory as well is based on a process of natural selection of randomly occurring variants. In my article, I cite other arguments also that lead to the conclusion that determinism isn't at all a consequence of scientific knowledge. There is also no reason to suppose that it's a necessary assumption of science. Probabilistic models are as scientific as deterministic ones. We come to see determinism as a prejudice, an ideology, or a myth, rather than a consequence of science. According to Bitsakis, determinism has had the historical merit of providing the scientists with a certain gnosiological optimism about the possibility of our intellect to discover the laws of nature. As long as science has moved forward to include probabilistic theories alongside deterministic ones, however, there is no longer any need to adhere to the pseudoscientific myth of universal determinism. However, is determinism at all plausible? To explore some of its aspects, let's start with Laplace's classical formulation in 1814. An intelligence which, for any given instant, would know all the forces by which nature is animated and the respective situation of the entities which compose it, if besides it were sufficiently vast to submit all these data to mathematical analysis, would encompass in the same formula the movements of the largest bodies in the universe and those of the lightest atom. For it, nothing would be uncertain, and the future, as the past, would be present before its eyes, or to its eyes. It's clear that Laplace is assuming the possibility of an intelligence as something external to the world, as something capable of a really extraordinary cognitive accomplishment, since it's able to account for all the forces and all the entities of the universe, and yet something that performs all this at no cost and without any limitation. We know now, by contrast, that information has a cost, that it depends on material supports that are part of the world, that knowledge depends on material and limited cognitive systems, among which the most complex one is the human brain, with its 86 billion neurons and its trillions of synapses. Nowadays, the idea of an intelligence that could know all the entities and all the forces of the universe, including therefore the very entities and forces that realize itself, seems totally fanciful, not to say meaningless. Moreover, I'll argue that determinism is a self-defeating doctrine. In fact, it's interesting that if we really accept determinism, we lose any basis or reason for believing it. The totally determined universal system imagined by determinism must necessarily include the individual herself that formulates this idea. It must include the intelligence itself that, even without the fantastic capacity assumed by Laplace, is able to believe that such an absolute concept of determinism is not only coherent, but true. However, this leads to an unsurmountable problem. If you believe in determinism, then it's not because the doctrine of determinism is true. It's not because the strict universal determinism really exists, but instead supposing determinism is true, because it was already determined since the Big Bang that you would believe in determinism, just as it was already determined that the person who doesn't believe in determinism would have this disbelief. We can never know who is right, the determinist or indeterminist, if determinism is true. This is because someone who decides to evaluate the arguments for and against determinism to find out who is right will only do so because she was determined to do so since the beginning of times. And she will only reach the conclusion she will reach similarly because it was already determined that she would reach it, whether it's true or false. Let's suppose you are a determinist. You discuss the question with an indeterminist, and you arrive to convince him that determinism is true. We cannot be sure it was the rationality of your argument that convinced him, since his being convinced was already determined. Neither can we be sure that your argument is really rational, because it seems rational to us, because it was determined that it would seem rational, not necessarily because it is rational. Truth and rationality, if determinism is true, are at most completely and ascertainable epiphenomena of totally determined events. So we arrive at the paradoxical situation in which, if determinism is true, it's impossible to ascertain that it is true. Another radical implication of determinism seems to be that a huge part of our language, that is, everything we say using modal verbs like should, can, could, etc., in addition to nouns such as choice, preference, decision, etc., is literally meaningless. It's a false language based on illusions. Determinism, to be coherent, must lead us to believe that our social interaction and our understanding of ourselves are based on completely illusory language and thought, from which, however, we cannot escape because we've been determined to use them. My conclusion is that a doctrine that has such devastating consequences is implausible, and that determinism is a belief that it's not worth having. To discard strict determinism, however, is not to discard causal determination or natural causation, or the idea that everything that occurs has a cause, including what occurs in mental life. What's important is to know whether the agent's will itself can be considered as determined by natural causes without losing its quality and its specificity. So, much more important than trying to establish the compatibility or incompatibility of free will with the extreme and implausible doctrine of determinism is trying to find out whether free will is compatible with causal determination. A new sense of compatibilism may therefore emerge from a reconsideration of the two terms whose compatibility is being questioned. It's the local probabilistic determination of the will by natural events that matters, not the total strict determination of the universe preached by determinism. Well, having discussed determinism and probabilistic causation, let's consider now the other term of the compatibility relation, namely free will. It has become somewhat of a fashion nowadays to consider that free will doesn't exist, that it's an illusion. But we need a concept of free will to be able to decide for or against its existence, to decide whether or not it's an illusion. You can agree that free will doesn't exist according to one concept of what free will is, but accept its existence according to another. You can agree that free will of a certain kind is an illusion, but that free will of another kind is not. A first concept assumes that free will implies escaping causal determination. A Google search presented lots of results for the phrases freedom from determination, freedom from determinism, and freedom from causality. No doubt the idea that an action is free when it's not causally determined has a significant presence in our culture. It's obvious that, according to this concept, free will is incompatible, by definition, with any form of causal determination. Within this first concept, however, how do free actions arise? One alternative is to consider that they come up by chance, that is, that they are undetermined. But the idea we have of a free action is very different from that of a random event. Sometimes it is said that they arise from themselves, but this seems more of a verbal jugglery, as Nietzsche caustically denounced in his criticism of the concept of causa sui. Another solution is to posit that they are determined by the subject or the agent or the person's consciousness, placing these outside the chains of natural causation. This type of proposal takes us to the insoluble difficulties of the mind-brain dualism. The problem is that we cannot understand how the immaterial spirit can, if not by magic, produce material effects, breaking the causal chains of natural phenomena. A second concept of free will is diametrically opposite to this one. Instead of considering that free will escapes causal determination, this concept admits causal determination and relates freedom of the will only to the lack of impediment to the fulfillment of a person's will. From this point of view, freedom of the will is just external freedom. It's a deflationary concept of free will. According to it, freedom is not a characteristic of the will, but rather of the conditions to which the expression of the will is submitted, as noted by McKenna and Coates. It's the conception of Hobbes and Hume, according to which free will is nothing but the unimpeded ability to do what one wants to do. Compatibility with causal determination is guaranteed, but at the price of abandoning the most significant intuitions we have about free will and all the meaning attached to it in our everyday interpersonal and social relations. Let's therefore look for other forms of conceiving free will. A third option has to do with the possibility of doing otherwise and the conditional analysis of this possibility. A prevalent conception is that an action is free when the person could also have done otherwise. This is the so-called principle of alternative possibilities, or of the possibility of doing otherwise. One assumption of this idea is that it has to do with the possibility of doing otherwise in the same situation in which the person did what she did. To do otherwise in a different situation might simply be the result of different external causes, not of free choice, of course. The link between free will and the possibility of doing otherwise is a very strong intuition that has characterized the thought of many authors, myself included. However, what does it mean to say that a person could have done otherwise? The philosopher G.E. Moore suggested the so-called conditional analysis of the possibility of doing otherwise. According to it, to say that a person could have done otherwise is to say that she would have done otherwise if she had decided to do so. The assumption about circumstances is also present here. That is, if the agent had wanted or decided to do otherwise in the same circumstances, she would have done so. It must be stressed that I'm using the word circumstances here according to the meaning of the prefix circum, which means around, surrounding. It refers to what surrounds a person, not including what is inside her. What is internal to the decision-making system itself and determines its valuations and choices will never be called a circumstance. It may be called a condition or a factor. So to say that the person could have done otherwise, even if the circumstances had been the same, doesn't exclude that the internal conditions of the decision-making system would have been different if she had done otherwise. A causal explanation is not therefore excluded, but the idea of the possibility of doing otherwise is preserved. Well, this conditional analysis has met with an objection by Chisholm in 1964. This is a classic objection to this analysis, which leads me to propose a modified version of the conditional interpretation in two steps as follows. One, to say that a person could have done otherwise means that she could have decided to do otherwise, and that if she had so decided, she would have done otherwise. So now we have to explain what it is to have decided to do otherwise. So we have the second step. To say that a person could have done otherwise means that if the decision-making process that led her to do what she did had been sufficiently different from what it was, she would have decided to do otherwise. So factors internal to the decision-making system would have been different and would have been responsible for a different decision, even if the circumstances in which the decision was made had been the same. This preserves the possibility of a causal explanation of alternative possibilities in the same circumstances. Another important element in the everyday notion of free action that gives rise also to a fourth philosophical concept of free will is that it originates from one's own self, from one's own will, not from something external to one's will. If someone pushes my arm and it hits you, I don't feel guilty for it. If you throw up on someone because of an unexpected and uncontrollable urge, you'll feel embarrassed and perhaps ashamed, but not exactly guilty because it wasn't intentional. The difference between an intentional act and an involuntary one is essential for a person's relationship with others and with oneself. If someone bumps into you while passing, it makes all the difference to know if it was accidental or purposeful. I think this element of the everyday notion of free will should be retained in a philosophical or scientific analysis. Some philosophers think that the agent must be the ultimate source of an action for this action to qualify as free. However, in order to admit this, we'd have to go back to the idea of causa sui or to the idea of indetermination. Since neither is adequate, as we have already noticed, one for being contradictory, the other for being insufficient, would have come to a dead end. However, nothing seems to justify this requirement. An action is free when caused by a decision-making process of the agent, but nothing prevents this decision-making process in its turn to have its causes. Robert Cain, for example, argues that the agent of a free action must have ultimate responsibility. That is, he must be responsible for anything that is sufficient reason for the occurrence of this action. We could, however, link responsibility to the condition that the action results from a conscious decision-making process of the agent without requiring responsibility for all the causes, internal or external, that participate in the generation of this process, or for the random events, by the way, that may also participate in it. Conclusions. The difference between free and unfree actions is important in everyday life, in our perception of ourselves, and in our social interactions, in our social relations. And it must be taken into account by philosophy and neuroscience. And it is an important question, the question about the relation between free actions and causal determination. However, causal determination should not be understood as determinism, as standardly defined. Determinism is not a scientific theory. It cannot be empirically tested, and it's not implied by science, although it's a popular doctrine among scientists and among contemporary philosophers. It is a highly implausible speculation and may be considered a myth. In particular, probabilistic causation should be recognized. Free will, on the other hand, should neither be understood as something uncaused, nor something that requires ultimate origination, nor merely as the absence of impediments. It may be conceived as the action of a decision-making brain system that considers more than one alternative and is capable of choosing one as a function of preferences, lower and higher order desires, values, principles, and expectations. Free actions are not uniquely determined by circumstances external to this decision-making system, although these certainly influence the choices that are made. They are also caused by individual characteristics of a person's decision-making system, which are in their turn caused by innumerable phylogenetic and ontogenetic factors. We have examined 4 concepts of free will. 2 of them were rejected, and I argued that elements of the other 2 should be preserved in a modified form. Free will, as I have suggested to conceive it, is compatible with local probabilistic causal determination. This idea is not compatibilism as it is traditionally defined, but it may indicate a much more relevant compatibility. It may perhaps be called new compatibilism. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you, Gilberto. Thank you very much. I'm going to ask you to stop sharing the presentation, please.
Excuse me?
Please just stop sharing the presentation.
Oh, yes.
Oh, yes. Here we go. Thank you very much. That was a really interesting, deep presentation. So now let's hear Marcelo Fischborn. And by the way, Gilberto, the questions are going to be saved to the end of both sections. So we're going to have the discussion afterwards, okay?
Okay.
Okay, can I start?
Yeah, go on, Marcelo.
Okay, I would like to start by thanking all the organizing committee for this wonderful conference, and especially Gabriel for putting together this wonderful event, especially during these very challenging times. And I think the kind words as well at the introduction. And I want to also thank especially Gilberto Gomes for being such a huge influence, I think, in many people here in Brazil that do research in this area. And in particular for me, he has been a very important influence. He has been in my master's committee and then also in my PhD committee. So thanks for all these years of interaction that have been very fruitful for me. The title of my talk here is A Starter for a Neuroscience of Responsibility episodes. And what I'll be addressing is more the possible implications of work in neuroscience for questions about responsibility understood in a broad sense. So there's a widespread hypothesis according to which neuroscience is expected to somehow have an impact on the way we hold other people responsible. And this may be in ordinary practices, but it has been addressed, especially in the legal sphere. And this quote from Greene and Cohen, I think it captures this hypothesis very well. The quote says, advances in neuroscience are likely to change the way people think about human action and criminal responsibility. Free will, as we ordinarily understand it, is an illusion generated by our cognitive architecture. Retributivist notions of criminal responsibility ultimately depend on this illusion, and if we're lucky, they will give way to consequentialist ones, thus radically transforming our approach to criminal responsibility. So I'll come back to this quote later in this presentation, but for now, the idea that matters to me here is that neuroscience is expected to have practical implications for issues about responsibility, and in particular, the criminal implementation of responsibility in the criminal justice system. Now, what I want to do here is to critically examine the standard assumptions behind the claim that neuroscience will impact responsibility practices, and in particular, assumptions about how and why neuroscience is to impact responsibility practices. And in addition, I want to describe an alternative, which I take to be a more plausible way neuroscience could inform changes in responsibility practices. Before going ahead, I want to specify a little bit on some terminology. By responsibility episodes, I want to refer approximately to events where an agent, which is the author of the responsibility episode, directs praise, blame, reward, or punishment towards someone, which is the target of the responsibility episode, in virtue of an evaluation of something the target did. So I think we are all familiar with this, and it's difficult to give a very precise definition, but I think this captures the phenomenon to a sufficient extent for the purposes of this talk. In addition, I want to refer to responsibility practices as a set that's composed of both responsibility episodes realized within some community, plus a set of shared beliefs and values that guide the realization of those responsibility episodes. So responsibility episodes are a part of responsibility practices together with norms and beliefs about how those responsibility episodes should be realized. And finally, I want to refer to a common view, which I take to be a central aspect of human moral psychology, which is the belief that human beings have free will and moral responsibility in a sense that often makes them deserve to be targets of responsibility episodes. So I think this is a very central part of the responsibility practices and human moral psychology more generally. So the plan for the talk is first to address this that I call the standard approach to how neuroscience would affect responsibility practices. And in this standard view, the targets are first the common view, and especially desert. So in the work such as the one by Greene and Cohen that I quoted earlier, the impact neuroscience is to have on questions about responsibility is dependent on the rejection of desert. And they also emphasize the impact on the legal sphere, not on more ordinary implementations of responsibility practices. And third, the parts of neuroscience that are more relevant for this approach are the neuroscience of decision making and action production, in a way that's inspired, I think, by the studies by Benjamin Libet and all the others in neuroscience that have followed that kind of study. In the second part, I want to describe some difficulties for the standard approach. And my focus here is the implementability of the changes in responsibility practices that are suggested on the basis of the standard approach. And third, I'll try to come up with an alternative approach, which I call the neuroscience of responsibility episodes. And here the targets will be a little bit different. I think there's room here for addressing the changes as a function of showing that certain consequences and more valuable ones may follow. I have an observation here because in the common view, in the way Greene and Cohen argue for their view, they also want to stress consequences, but I think there's a different way here for including the consequences. But in addition, in this alternative view, we don't need to be focused only on the consequence. So there's room for other kinds of considerations as well. And there's also room for considering an impact of neuroscience on ordinary practices and not just in the legal system. And finally, there's a different, there are different parts of neuroscience that are more relevant in this project, which I call here the neuroscience of responsibility episodes, which is the neuroscience of what happens when someone holds or is held responsible by someone else. So the standard approach has as a core assumption the idea that the hypothesis that neuroscience will impact responsibility practices by challenging the common view. And the challenges that are described here are basically challenges to the reality of desert, the idea that people can deserve to be the targets of responsibility episodes. There's also in this view a tendency to focus on responsibility practices within the legal sphere, although I don't want to count that as an essential feature of what I'm calling the standard approach, but it's been a recurrent feature of this approach that the focus usually is on responsibility practices within the legal sphere. Now, as I anticipated earlier, I think the work by Benjamin Libet has been in the historical roots of this approach, this standard approach. And I won't review the studies again because they have been addressed in previous talks. But what I want to stress here is that Libet himself did not deny the possibility of free will. This has been mentioned previously, but he rather restricted free will to the conscious control of whether or not an unconscious urge or intention to act would result in action. So he was really considering the possibility that what he called the veto power could be the place where free will is exercised. And in addition to that, he did in fact connect his research on free will and in neuroscience with issues that are part of responsibility practices, although in a very marginal way. So he was ready to claim that parts of our mental lives that do begin unconsciously, according to his studies, should not be considered guilty or sinful. So if we have an unconscious, an urge that begins unconsciously, he thought we should not feel or be held guilty or sinful just because we had that urge if we later on veto that urge and don't act on it. So he had in mind here especially religious views according to which you can do wrong just by thinking the wrong things. And I think what's important for me here is that he thought that his studies could have implications for issues about responsibility, about how we should implement responsibility episodes. He just didn't generalize it because he didn't think we don't have free will generally. So to come back to Greene and Cohen, I think they express very clearly this standard approach. They say that advances in neuroscience are likely to change the way people think about human action in criminal responsibility. And the target here is the common view. He says that free will, as we ordinarily understand it, is an illusion, and that by appreciating what neuroscience has to tell us, we can give up retributivist notions of criminal responsibility in a way that gives way to consequentialist ones. And they also think that this is a radical transformation of the approach to criminal justice. So I'll have later on qualifications about retributivism here, but I think they're rejecting desert as a whole, and I think we can't keep desert even though we need not be retributivists. So I'll come to that later on. An additional aspect of their view here is that the contribution of neuroscience is a sort of persuasive tool here. They say that neuroscience can vividly illustrate lessons that some people appreciated long ago. So it's as if the lesson here is not new, is that just neuroscience giving some extra support for a certain view, and that we could know that without neuroscience somehow. So I'll mention that in later on again. So I think there are some difficulties for the standard approach. And there are some difficulties that are internal, and I won't discuss them at length here. But I think there's a growing consensus that has been mentioned in this conference thus far, and it's thanks to the work by Gilberto Gomes, Adina Roskis, Alfred Milley, Edina Amias, Thomas Nadelhofer, and many others, that the standard reading of certain neuroscience results have relied on questionable assumptions about free will, what free will requires, about what folks mean by free will and moral responsibility. And they have also pointed out issues about the methods and interpretation of the results. So again and again, challenges to the reality of free will have relied on these questionable assumptions. And this has led to, I think this is the standard view now, the consensus view, that so far neuroscience has not shown us that no one has free will. And for me here, a background question is, can neuroscience still have any implications about responsibility practices once we stop believing that neuroscience has shown us that no one is free? Another way of putting the question is, do we need neuroscience to show us that we're not free, if it is to have any practical implications about responsibility? And I think the answer is no. We can have lessons, practical lessons derived from neuroscience that do not depend on skepticism about free will. So the problem, those internal difficulties are not my main motivation for criticizing the standard approach, but what's more important, I think, is what we'll call problems about the implementability of the implications or the suggestions that are based on skepticism. So Greene and Cohen themselves address the concern, the objection, according to which our commitments to free will and retributivism are simply inescapable for all practical purposes. So what they have in mind here is the possibility that maybe theoretical work can show that we don't have free will, but will that be taken into account in our daily lives? And the sources of this objection they considered are Peter Strawson's freedom and resentment, the idea that responsibility may be just a part of the way we human beings live. It's a part of our way of living, and that the only way to escape that will be to radically transform what is to have ordinary human relations. And he was very skeptical that we could give up on this, on seeing one another as responsible agents. Greene and Cohen also mentioned studies on the evolution of human cooperation, where punishment, for example, has been described as a key factor for allowing us humans to have the sort of cooperative behavior we have these days. And in particular, altruistic punishment has been claimed to be a very central feature of the way human beings establish social relations among themselves. And in addition, they also consider the possibility and even the evidence that this disposition to hold others responsible is installed in our own brains. So quoting from them here, the impulse to exact punishment may be driven by phylogenetically old mechanisms in the brain. So they consider this possibility, and they have an answer to that. And their answer is based on an analogy. The analogy compares the situation in the sphere of responsibility with a situation between Euclidean and non-Euclidean views of space. They say that in our daily activities, it's almost unavoidable for us to see the space as flat when we go to the supermarket or when we are doing our normal life stuff. We see the space as flat, but as contemporary physics suggests, in exceptional cases, it may be possible for us to consider the space as curved. And the kind of exceptional case they mention is, for instance, the launching of a spacecraft where engineers and scientists are better equipped if they adopt a different view of space. If they think of space as curved, they will have more precise procedures. So they applied this analogy to the case of responsibility. And here I quote from them again. They say that for most day-to-day purposes, it may be pointless or impossible to view ourselves or others in this detached sort of way. The detachment here is to see others not as responsible. This is the detachment here. And they also say it may not be pointless or impossible to adopt this perspective when one's deciding what the criminal law should be, or whether a given defendant should be put to death for his crimes. So they think the reason why they move from ordinary case to the legal sphere is based on this concern that maybe it's very difficult for us to give up on seeing each other as morally responsible agents. Now, I'm very unconvinced that their reply to the concern they themselves raise is successful. I think there's an additional problem here. In addition to the evidence they themselves mentioned, I think there's further evidence and further issues here to be addressed. One problem is the problem that I call here the problem of legislation in democracies. In democracies, if we're to have a change in the law, those changes will be put forth by people that are representatives of the whole population. So you need voters to put the persons that will be in charge of legislation. And it's very unlikely, I think, that people will vote for people that have very different views from their own. And so if in our daily lives we are unable or it's very difficult for us to see others not as responsible agents, I think it's unlikely that people will vote for people who defended a view of people as not responsible agents. In addition, there's further evidence for the robustness of the common view, and there are numerous studies on human moral psychology and beliefs about free will. And I mentioned just one here, but there has been many of these studies lately. And in a chapter by Schuller, Nadelhofer, Namias, and Kathleen Voss, in the book Surrounding Free Will, they mention difficulties for manipulating belief in free will in experiments. So belief in free will seems very robust and a very central and stable feature of human moral psychology. And other meta-analyses and other studies have shown that as well. And in addition, some studies have suggested that even when you're able to manipulate belief in free will in the lab, it's hard to find evidence that those changes in belief entail different behaviors. So even if the belief can change a little, maybe you won't see any change in the behavior that are derived from that change in belief. In addition, I think the history of punishment also tells against the rejection of the common view, further attests the robustness of the common view. And we have punishment in pretty much all society we know of, and both present and in the past. So I think on the basis of all these studies that the analogy Greene and Cohen offer is weak in the face of the evidence. And I think they themselves may have acknowledged this when in the end of the paper they say that retributivist notions of criminal responsibility will give way to consequentialist ones if we are lucky, they say, if we are lucky. So if we need luck, I think it's because the view is somehow implausible in the face of how human moral psychology works. So on that basis, I think an alternative view may have some chance here. And the basic idea I want to suggest is that there's room for reform of responsibility practices without accepting skepticism about moral responsibility and the common view. So one way to illustrate this, I think, is from history. And in the episodes where we find transformations of the way responsibility practices, and in particular here punishment, have been put forth. So Morris and Rothman, in the introduction of a 1995 book, they say that they describe the transition from punishment implemented in public spaces to punishment more similar to what we have now in like prisons. So they say at first the execution spectacle was scary and intimidating, and the monarch and his subordinates zealously used the occasion to bolster the authority of the royal government. But in time, executions became the occasion for rudeness and disgust. Thus, it became desirable to mete out punishment away from the public gaze and to find alternatives to the gallows. What I think here is illustrated in this passage is that changes in punishment practices need not be based on thinking about whether or not people deserve to be punished for the wrong they do. So desert didn't play in this historiographical description here a role in making change, and a change that may have been very important in the history of humanity. So I think the lesson here, and I think there's also empirical evidence of human moral psychology that we can do this, that consequences matter alongside the common view. We can think of people as deserving some sort of response, depending on what they do, but that when choosing what the response is to be, we can take into account what the consequences will be. In this case, the consequences were pretty external to the person being subjected to punishment, but it's still a case where consequences are considered. And I think this makes room for a different way of thinking about how neuroscience could inform changes in responsibility practices. I want to move now to different work here. And I think this will add as well to this alternative approach. So Adrian Raine has described the biological causes or roots of violence, and his work has been very influential as well. So at a certain point, he describes a functional neuroanatomical model of violence. And in this model, he includes cognitive, affective, and motor processes related to violence that can result from brain malfunctioning. And he gives some examples of what those processes can be. He includes poor planning and organization, impaired attention, poor decision-making, lack of empathy, poor emotion regulation, failure to inhibit inappropriate responses, impulsivity, and motor excess. Now, this part of Rain's model, I think, fits nicely within the standard approach. And indeed, it's the way Rain himself seems to see his work. So this first may count as making the causes of behavior sufficiently vivid in Greene and Cohen's phrase. And the target here seems to be, again, the common view. The processes he's describing are processes related to decision-making, how people decide and proceed in behavior. So Rain says, I do believe that in tomorrow's world, we can raise above our feelings of retribution, reach out for rehabilitation, and engage in a more human discourse on the causes of violence. So he seems to see the impact of his view here again as depending on the rejection of retribution, on rejecting the common view to some extent. So Rain also has a different set of processes in that model. And I think, although he doesn't make the distinction, I think this distinction is important when thinking about the practical implications of neuroscience. So in this other part, he describes the following processes: reduced capacity to adequately process rewards and punishments, insensitivity to punishment cues that guide behavior, lack of guilt and embarrassment, and failure to avoid punishment. So these processes are different. The second group of processes are not just about decision-making and action production. They're also about how individuals respond to being held responsible. So it suggests, I think, the second group of processes suggests an alternative way of thinking about the revision of the practices. I'm sorry, I think that there's some noise here in the neighborhood. I'm not sure you can hear that as loudly as I am hearing. So the different object for neuroscience that we can put forth here in this alternative view, I separate it in two parts. First, there's something I call the neuroscience of being held responsible, which is something we can derive from Rain's ambiguity. The second group of processes, the focus here is on what happens at the neural level on the target of a responsibility episode. What happens when someone is held responsible for an action? And the second part here for this alternative approach is what they call the neuroscience of holding responsible. And this part can be taken from Greene and Cohen's concern, which here the focus is on what happens at the neural level when someone's holding others responsible. So here we can investigate also why it is so difficult for people to stop seeing others as responsible. There might be something, and there is something that happens at the neural level as well that can help us understand this. So to conclude here, I will just describe very briefly some studies from neuroscience on each of these fronts. So first, on the neuroscience of being held responsible, and then something on the neuroscience of holding responsible. I could have stopped here, but I think that what comes next is the part of the work that's not ready yet, but I think it gives, it supports the idea that there might be something promising here to be explored. So on the neuroscience of being held responsible, one of the central works is by Edmund Rolls. He has a paper on the orbital frontal cortex and reward. So he highlights the role the orbital frontal cortex has on how we process rewards and to some extent punishment as well. So he describes that in monkeys, damage to the orbitofrontal cortex can result in impaired learning of associations between stimuli and rewards, and also difficulties for learning when the association between a stimulus and a reward changes. So people may have monkeys in this case can have difficulty in processing and understanding that an association between a stimuli and reward has changed. In humans, he describes as changes associated with problems in the orbitofrontal cortex, disinhibited or socially inappropriate behavior, misinterpretation of other people's moods, impulsiveness, failure to switch strategy, even when large punishments were incurred. So in one of the types of cases here, in a gambling task, a person may persist choosing a deck of cards that was once rewarded, even when it starts to involve punishments for the individual when he loses money by choosing that deck. The individual simply can't change to a better strategy once he started in that one. Additional work here has investigated whether or not the neural basis of punishments, of what happens when you are punished, is different from the neural basis of what happens when you are rewarded. And there's also research here on more social implementations of punishment. The cases that Rawls mentions are somewhat different from what happens in more common interactions between individuals, but there has also been studies on more social versions where punishment is more similar to the way I have described responsibility episodes in the beginning. A second part of this neuroscience of being held responsible has explored some particular conditions that can affect the way rewards and punishments are processed. One study is about says that there are sex differences in sensitivity to rewards and punishments. I think that may be relevant because the prison population is disproportionately that has much more males than females, and I think that this is a established fact that is still difficult to understand fully. And here there's also a clue about why that may be so. There are also studies of the brain impact, what happens in the brain when someone's subjected to corporal punishment as a child. This is a little bit different because the other studies I mentioned are about how the way your brain affects how you respond to being held responsible. And here is what happens here is that if you are held responsible in a certain way, then your brain changes and you have an impact in your future life. An additional set of studies here on special conditions is in this study by Bressel and others from 2018. And here I think this is very, very interesting. And they say that addictions, impulse control disorders, psychopathy, anxiety, and depression, all these conditions can show variations in how people respond to punishment. And they say that a better understanding of the cellular, circuit, and cognitive mechanisms of punishment will make important contributions to the next generation of therapeutic approaches. So just to give one example here, in the case of depression, I have mentioned this in a comment in another talk in the first day. Depression has been shown to include extra sensitivity to punishment and reduced sensitivity to rewards. So this is like a profile, a responsibility profile. Depending on your psychiatric condition, you may have a specific way of responding when you are held responsible, either to punishments, to rewards. And I think this opens very interesting possibilities here. Maybe this can guide our choices about how to respond to what other individuals do, depending on the particular conditions they have. And to move to the second part here of this Neuroscience of Responsibility episodes here, I'm focusing on what happens at the neural level when you are holding someone else responsible. So in the first group of studies, the impact is how your brain is when you are being held responsible. And here the focus is on what happens when you are holding others responsible, when you are the author of a responsibility episode. One central study here is by Kruger and Hoffman, and they describe 3 systems for third-party punishment. And in these systems, they say the first is what they call a salience network, which is a set of parts of the brain that execute the function of detecting norm violations and the seriousness of the norm violation. And here, what's detected is the amount of harm and the emotional weight of the situation. Then they say there's also a second network, which they call the default mode network, which integrates the salience network with an assessment of intention. And here's where blame results. So here's where we form the judgment that someone is blameworthy for an action. And I think here, this is a comment just on their work, that this part here is consistent with an idea of basic desert, because what this part of the network is considered is simply what the other agent did and whether or not it's a violation, whether or not it was intentional. Further considerations that we include in notions of responsibility that are not focused on basic desert are not present in parts 1 and 2 of the model. So, but there is a third part, and here is where I think things become even more interesting. They call the central executive network. And here's where we go from blame to the punishment decision. This may involve a scale for how much punishment a certain type of crime or violation should receive. But more importantly, there's a space here for contextual facts. And here I think, although they do not mention this, there should be space for considerations about consequences. I think it's a behavioral fact that we do consider consequences when deciding how to express blame, and we don't do that all that often in our daily lives, but to punish someone, I think there's space for considerations about the consequences. So we don't blame our neighbors just because they did something we think is wrong and blameworthy. We may think that how that will affect our relation with them, and maybe we'll decide in some cases that it's better not to say anything now. And I think we do that all the time, and this space for contextual facts here acknowledges that possibility. What they do consider is the legal impact, and here they explore the possibility that this kind of study may explain how judges think when deciding how to define punishment amount and things like that, and also the impact of very emotional cases that may somehow change our approach to not third-party punishment, but something they call second-party punishment, which are cases where the person punishing the author of a responsibility episode is personally involved, and that tends to make the emotional level higher, and tends to make the person more punitive. Second and last part of the review is again some special cases here. There's one research about how the BDNF gene might affect the use of corporal punishment. So the earlier study was about how someone that is corporally punished is affected here is what might facilitate someone, a parent in this case, to use corporal punishment as a disciplinary measure. And they investigate here this gene that affects how neurotransmitters are distributed and work in the brain, and whether or not this affects the use of corporal punishment. They find some evidence, but it's very interrelated to more contextual and environmental factors. But they do find some evidence that this genetic factor here affecting the brain might be related to the use of corporal punishment. There's another study here that's about how the ventromedial prefrontal cortex damage can result in reduced third-party punishment to violent crime. So I think this is interesting because what often comes up in the standard approach is that you want to reduce punishment, even especially for very violent crimes, because of the neural causes of that behavior. And here this study has associated problems in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex to a special condition that also results in not seeing violent crimes as something to be seriously punished. So I think this is also illuminating. And Petal, there are other studies here on forgiving unintentional harms, what's involved in the brain when you are forgiving, and also on the punishment of crimes with good intentions. I think all this opens many doors here that can be further explored. And as final words here, I think this alternative approach has some potential, is this that I have been trying to defend in this talk. This is not a definitive assessment, but I think the starting of a project that I want to see is promising. The advantages of this view is that it avoids the conflict with the common view. It can be informative about what changes in responsibility practices could be beneficial. It's not just an illustration of an old lesson, as Greene and Cohen suggest. And I think it also can deepen our understanding of the common view and responsibility practices as a whole, including how they are or are not likely to change. So I think there must be a scientific approach to how responsibility practices can be changed, not just a normative command here that because we think that free will is an illusion, people should change the way they hold others responsible. I think we should study how that change might happen as well in a scientific way, just as we are studying the neuroscience of action production, also the neuroscience of how people hold others responsible. And finally, there is the possibility here to inform change in ordinary responsibility episodes, not just in the legal context. I think that the information that some of these studies can give us might be useful even in ordinary relations, especially for people who are living with persons that have special conditions. And this is the final quote. I think I want to emphasize this a Straussonian forgotten lesson here, and I will just read what he said. These human attitudes themselves have to an increasing extent become objects of study in the social and psychological sciences. However, we are not to suppose that we are required or permitted as philosophers to regard ourselves as detached from the attitudes which, as scientists, we study with detachment. This is in no way to deny the possibility and desirability of redirection and modification of our human attitudes in light of these studies. But we may reasonably think it unlikely that our progressively greater understanding of certain aspects of ourselves will lead to the total disappearance of those aspects. So I thank your attention, and that's it.
Thank you, Marcelo. I will open the discussion section right now. If you are in this room, you can just raise your hand if you want to ask anything. And I'm going to start myself with a question here. I'm seeing here that there are 3 questions already in the Q&A. But I just want to ask something to Gilberto Gomes. Gilberto, well, you started your presentation saying that determinism is, in a certain sense, pseudo scientific theory. It's pretty much a myth that some scientists, like Einstein, maybe, just kind of hold for some reason or other, but actually it's not something that science can show to be true or not. And then you go through this argument in which you first argue that determinism is a self-defeating doctrine, and you end just concluding after some considerations, you conclude that, well, it's just implausible or devastating. It's an ugly theory. I mean, everything's gonna go down. We don't want this thing to be true, right? And it's not scientific, by the way, right? My question is the following. I agree that actually science is not in a position to show determinism to be true. That certainly is something they don't have the means to do. But can it show determinism to be false? I mean, it seems to fall entirely outside the scope of science. So isn't it another myth? I mean, it may be an ugly thing. We don't want it. But is it an argument to prove it false? We can just say, like, we prefer to go without it. And actually, it's out of the scope of reason, maybe entirely. Maybe science must be silent about it. It might be the ugly true, but I just didn't get the second point, how science can actually argue for the falsity of determinism. Maybe it must be just silent about it.
Yeah, I didn't say that science can argue for the falsity of determinism, because I think it's unfalsifiable, as well as it is not subject to confirmation. But I think that simply from a scientific or philosophical point of view, it should not be endorsed, because there's no reason to endorse it.
Okay, so maybe I understand we should not endorse it, but maybe we should just leave it in some sort of a aside as an unsolved metaphysical question.
Yes, but it
right.
has such devastating consequences, according to what I have argued. I don't know if you agree with my argument, but if in fact it has these devastating consequences, I think that it would be very peculiar for us to try to put our bets on such an implausible doctrine.
Well, I see it. I don't want to, hold devastating views. I mean, you're right. For sure. I don't want to do that. I'm just saying that it's still an open question. That's how I feel it. It doesn't make it implausible. It makes it ugly or devastating. And I just don't know what to say about it. And I prefer to go as if it's not the case, because
There
it's too
are
devastating.
other examples, there are other arguments to suggest that it is implausible. For instance, quantum mechanics. It's an established physical theory of great important consequences. And it doesn't support determinism. And the fact that other branches of science also do not support, do not presuppose, and do not support determinism, such as biology and evolution, genetics. I imagine other fields, I haven't studied this in detail, but I imagine that meteorology meteorology,
Mhm.
I think also has to do mainly with probabilistic models. And so I really don't think that we have the need or the justification to still rely to those ideas that were influenced. Of course, they existed before in the history of philosophy, but they were reinforced by Newtonian physics in a certain way, even though, according to Ehrman, in his book A Primer of Determinism, he says that Newtonian physics, it's not a paradise for determinism. Yeah? Those specific laws of motion of Newton may have necessary and sufficient consequences. They may make predictions of effects that follow necessarily and sufficiently from the causes. But if we take the theory as a whole, Ehrman speaks of boundary conditions that would make it, in fact, hostile, as he says, to the idea of determinism. And the same he says regarding Einstein's general relativity theory. And I have my knowledge of physics is insufficient to evaluate these these ideas. But Herman argues in this way. So I think there are many ideas not to consider that it's a good doctrine to consider seriously as a theory that has such a prominent place in considering something that is important, that which is the possible compatibility of free will with natural determination of events. I think this is important. Why put the extreme determinism into this question? I don't think this is reasonable.
Well,
That's my
I mean,
point.
yeah, I entirely agree. But maybe the only difference between us is that I don't think that science, as you actually repeated now, give us any sort of evidence against the strong thesis of determinism. I just think that that's a metaphysical, maybe some sort of Kantian approach. I think that's not something that we can actually reasonably answer. So I just leave it aside and deal with the more important things we have to deal with. People acting and we blame people. We have to deal with that. So I just take this metaphysical issue aside, and I still think that science can't help much. But at the end, I agree. I mean, I don't think we should tackle the free will and responsibility, all these issues, resorting to this notion of strong determinism. But anyway, I really like the presentation.
But I agree that science doesn't give us conclusive arguments against, but neither does it give us conclusive arguments for determinism.
Right.
So,
Okay, I'm going to read some of the questions here in the Q&A. We have these questions from Anne Vroom from Washington, D.C. And she asks, I'm going to read the question first, and then I'm going to see to whom it's addressed, right? Does the school of thought that holding responsible, so that's to Marcelo, I guess, does the school of thought that holding responsible is a bad thing also believe that with regard to rewarding? For example, if a person achieves something positive, should we also not hold them responsible for that positive action? For example, should we not give Olympic medals on the theory that the Olympians should not be thought of as responsible for their achievements?
Okay, thanks for the question. I think there is a bias in this literature in focusing on the part of the responsibility system that's negative, where we respond to bad things and in a bad way, so to speak. So, and the reason for that is that that seems to be the most challenging case, because responsibility and the idea of desert may be the only reason we have to treat some people badly or to cause harm to someone intentionally and saying that it's a good thing. So I think the pressure goes to that possibility, because that's where it's more morally pressing to have a good justification for that kind of practice. And I think that's the reason why it's usually people usually focus on punishment, for example. But I think most people would see the skeptics will continue to hold that we can reward others, because there's nothing very difficult to justify in that kind of practices. While in the case of punishment, it is something that seems to ask for a justification. So I think that's the reason why there's this bias in the literature.
Right. I have this. Hold on. I have this question from Nitama.
Hold on. There are other. I think Gilberto and Gabriel both looked like they had comments about what was just asked, because I think you guys are forgetting the hand. Like their hands are up.
I just want to give a brief announcement. I don't want to repress this beautiful debate, but we have labor laws in this country. We have also union regulations. So what's going to happen? Exactly, 6:30 are going to liberate our simultaneous interpreter. We keep doing the debate in English as far as people have energy. Okay? So Renato has raised his hand as well. Let's keep the debate until we.
Am I missing something? I'm not seeing the hands raised here. Who else has the
Thomas?
raise the hand?
Thomas was the first to raise his hand. Please.
Oh, why can't I see it here? I'm sorry. I thought that no one raised the hands here. I was like, oh, no one wanna ask it.
No problem.
So who was the first one, Thomas? Please.
The order is Thomas, Renato, and Gilberto, and there's also 2 new questions in the Q&As.
Okay, so let's go.
And I have questions as well, but my frontal lobe's still working okay, and I try not to be the audience animator here, you know.
So I want to connect what Marcelo Aurelio said to what Gilberto was saying a couple minutes ago, and try to stand the argument against determinism on its head, right? So here's what we also don't have and will never have: evidence for strict indeterminism. That's what we don't have, and science won't give us that any more than it will give us determinism. Now I'm just going to run the same argument, right? Believing things are random and disordered like that is like disorienting, makes it seem like everything is pointless, disconnects us from our actions. I mean, so indeterminism, call it strict indeterminism, is also kind of an awful thing. I mean, the whole debate in philosophy, someone used James earlier, the whole point was like, neither one of these are great. And indeed, hard incompatibilists like Pereboom will say it's for partly this reason that they don't think we can be free either way. You're not going to get it no matter which of these ways you go. And then that doesn't depend on the science at all, because you say, look, one or the other has to be true. We can't know which one of them is true, but one of them has to be true just in virtue of what they are, and we can't be free either way. And then it doesn't depend on the science. I mean, that's an argument that just doesn't depend on the science being true or showing one rather than the other. We're just going to assume the science clearly can't show one or the other. And then we're left trying to figure out, like fumbling in the dark, what we want. And, people like Pereboom say, well, I guess we got to say that we're not free and responsible. I mean, that's a way of trying to just do what you did for determinism to the other side. And then we're just left with Well, you could be left with James. I would probably side with Paraboom, but like I'm fine either way. Yeah.
Well, I think that indeterminism, if we take it to be the opposite of determinism, of course, it does not solve the problem of free will. But we may stress also that the negation of indeterminism, the refusal of indeterminism, does not exclude determination. So indeterminism is not the absence of determination. Within indeterminist, as the opposite of determinist, would be just the refusal of the extreme doctrine of determinism. But it may also recognize that events have causes, that there is a determination, but in many cases, this determination may be just probabilistic, which doesn't exclude that in some cases it may be also a determination of something with a probability of 1, that is a strict determination in certain cases, as in the example of Newton's laws of motion. But anyway, even this conception of causal determination without determinism, I think it is necessary for an explanation of free will, but of course it's not sufficient. It's not enough to say that there is indetermination to explain free will, because we don't experience free will as a chance decision, as a random decision. No. So it's just something necessary but not sufficient. For explaining free will itself, I have resorted to a concept of a system in the brain that is capable of decision making. This system takes into account external influences, but it's not completely determined by the influences that are external to the system. It also depends on internal conditions, so it preserves the possibility of a causal explanation of free decisions, but at the same time, these decisions are not mechanically determined by external situations. They depend on the patterns of evaluation internal to the decision-making system, including a certain degree of randomness, perhaps greater or less, depending on the case, on what is being decided. But if you ask me, do you want a Merlot wine or a Cabernet Sauvignon? Well, it may be a certain amount of randomness in my choice, because in fact I enjoy both. But anyway, there is something that leads to a decision which is internal to the decision system itself, so it rescues the idea of a causal determination. I don't know if I have answered your question.
Yeah, no, that was helpful. I guess I was trying to, well, first off, the name of your book should be decisions, determination, and determinism. It's like you got a great like alliteration. But yeah, I guess so maybe this is the way of thinking about it. Like I was trying to suggest it's a kind of dilemma because we can't really know one way or the other. And then you have to flesh out what you think would be true if one or the other were the case. Even then it's puzzling because you're not going to know, right? Unless you think you can't be free in either case. And then so what you've decided is that you think there's a better chance of preserving free will and responsibility if we go the indeterminism route than the determinism route, which is, I mean, that's fine, but it's not because then it's a decision about what is going to make it easiest for you to preserve free will. It's not a decision about the metaphysical nature of the world because you're not going to get an answer to that either way. So then, which by the way, I think is, if anything, I might go the other direction. So I might think that it's easier for me to get my mind around how we could be free and determined than free if things are indeterministic in the way that quantum physics suggests. And so I actually think I would lay my stake on the other side. But I think the point I was making is that then the metaphysical views are playing a strange role, because what we're trying to do is can we preserve what we want? And then we'll take whichever metaphysical theory can give that to us. And if it turns out we have what we want, but neither metaphysical theory can give it to us, then we end up abandoning free will in the way that Per Boom did. So I guess it's more about I think the epistemology of what you were saying was super interesting. That's what I wanted to get my mind around the epistemology, because I think someone had mentioned Nietzsche earlier, but I mean, this is a way in which, being interested in our motives for accepting and rejecting certain metaphysical theses is an important thing we should spend more time about. And I just thought what your talk, which was great, by the way, gave me a chance to think through how I view the relationship between the views about agency I prefer and the views about metaphysics that I might gerrymander, that I might change in order to suit my other desires, which is interesting. So I was just trying to suggest that the way you were thinking about it, someone else, maybe me, I'd have to think more carefully, might do the same thing just in the opposite direction, which I thought was fascinating. It's an interesting about the relationship between the metaphysics and whatever else. So anyway, so it was great. That was really all. It was more just I wanted to pause to think about what I took to be something very interesting. So.
Thank you very much for your question and your commentary.
Okay, now I'm going to read a question by Nitamar de Oliveira. He says, I would like to thank both Gilberto and Marcelo for their excellent talks. Let me ask a question to each one of you. Gilberto, I gather from what you said about Laplace's determinism, relativity, and quantum physics, that you were moving away from some absolutist view of metaphysical determinism. Now, are you actually making a case for some sort of mitigated compatibilism by mitigating traditional views of determinism? So that's the question to Gilberto, and the other one's a short one to Marcelo. Marcelo, insofar as the neural underpinnings of holding and being held responsible are concerned, how would you respond to critics of intentionality who tend to dismiss consciousness as an illusion? So first,
You want to answer first, Marcelo? Go ahead.
Okay, I was reading the question again. Critics of intentionality that tend to dismiss consciousness as an illusion. So I think it's, I have tried to give reasons to think that for practical purposes, I think that rejecting free will not have the impact that people have thought it could have on how we treat each other in terms of responsibility. So I think it's, I don't know if it's possible in theory to show that free will is an illusion, or that consciousness is an illusion. I doubt that that could have an impact. So if the question that I'm trying to answer here is, how's the best way to implement responsibility practices? Is there a better way for doing that? Then I think we need to consider different studies and different questions, not simply the question of whether or not people are free. So that's the approach I'm taking now.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure I answered the question, but I hope I have made clear my view.
All right, and Gilberto, ready to answer?
Yes. I see here, Nitamar, that you ask, you say, are you actually making a case for some sort of mitigated compatibilism by mitigating traditional views of determinism? No doubt I'm questioning the extreme determinists, but I want to preserve determination, not determinism in the sense of an absolute and universal and strict determination that I have conceived in terms of necessary and sufficient causes for all events. But I want to preserve, and this is perhaps the sense you have given to the word mitigated. I want to preserve the idea of determination, of causal determination, of thinking that events have causes, and including the idea of probabilistic determination. So this is perhaps what you mean by mitigating traditional views of determinism. And compatibilism would have to do with this, accepting on one side this less extreme and more reasonable, I would say, a concept of natural causal determination, and on the other hand, a suitable concept of free will, which is neither deflationary as the usual compatibilism theory, and on the other hand, that keeps certain essential properties, such as this idea of the possibility of doing otherwise, and the subject as the origin of a free action, but with certain adaptations, as I have presented in my talk.
All right. So now we are past 6:30 Brazilian time, so we are going untranslated. But doesn't matter. I guess Renato is the next one. And I just want to make sure who else has raised the hand here, because I can't see the hands. It's Renato
Gabriel, Santiago Amaya.
Gabriel, Santiago. Okay. So
myself also, I'd like to make a question.
Oh, you too.
Oh, Gilberto, yeah, actually before.
Okay. So please, Renato.
Okay, so I'll try to be very quick. Thank you, Gilberto and Marcelo, for both brilliant talks. I had questions for both, but actually Thomas' question has covered my question to Gilberto completely. I'm very, very much in line with his observations. So Marcelo, I'd like to ask you something about one part of your talk, which I thought it was absolutely brilliant. I had 10,000 questions here, and maybe I can send them to you later. But this is about the problem of implementability. And you talked about legislation in democracies, and that would be a problem. And I'd like to ask, that how do you feel about the fact that legislators, they do not apply the law, that judges do apply the law? Of course, if that gets very extreme, then we have a big problem of the legitimacy of the judges. If they do, there's a big fallout between the two parts. But in the end, as far as democracies are still working, legislators create the law, but judges do apply the law. And to use Greene's and Cohen's metaphor, they are the rocket scientists that have to surpass folk physics to actually fly rockets to the moon, right? So they are the ones that should consider the consequences of punishment and not just the folk psychology about it. It's not about dehumanizing them, the judges, of course. It is about them making a scientifically informed decision about human behavior. And this is why I strongly think that we have to further study the effect of free will beliefs and neuroscientific education on such a population that is judges. I'd like to hear you about this, if it makes sense.
Okay, thanks, Renato. It's a very, very good question. I don't have an answer to that. I think it's important to know as well the place judges have in this whole system, and by what you himself was saying the other day, I think that judges will be maybe even more similar to ordinary people in these matters, perhaps in sometimes, and there's this additional fact that they are dealing with particular cases, and there are studies that suggest that when you were in face of criminal behavior or wrong acts or acts that violate our moral codes and our legal codes, then we tend to reinforce our view of others as morally responsible agents. So I think that creates an additional problem here. But I think that will be a greater problem if we, in theory, we were sure that we don't have free will and moral responsibility. But I mentioned also like internal difficulties for the view that we don't have free will, at least when these arguments are based on neuroscience. So, but I think this should be part of this investigation of the scientific study of under what conditions responsibility practices will change. I think if we want to study it as a scientific question, we need to address all the parts that are involved from the planning of a responsibility system. That's an activity that may be more like something theoretical to the actual implementation of that in particular instance. I think we need to understand all that better in order to understand how the system could be changed effectively. So thanks for the question. I'm sure I didn't answer it, but I think that the question is a very good one.
Thank you very much. You completely answered.
The question from Gilberto, right? Oh, you have to unmute yourself, please. We can hear you. Right.
So, Marcelo, my question is not directly, specifically to something that you propose. It's something that is traditional in this theory and these discussions, which is the distinction between retributive and consequentialist punishment. So the retributive versus consequentialist view of punishment, and we might add of reward too. So, in fact, I'm not a specialist on this point. I haven't studied it very much, but I can't see such a big difference between the two, because from a biological point of view, I think I'm very much influenced by Darwinian evolutionist point of view. So it seems to me that this urge to retribute evils that were caused by people, or from the other side also to praise good things that have been done, this retributive impulse, that tendency to view a meaning in retributing these with punishment if it's bad, or with praise if it's good, has, of course, consequentialists' consequences. It's redundant what I've said, but anyway, it's justified by a consequentialist, because a consequentialist view also, because when you punish someone, you diminish, in principle, you diminish the possibility that that person or other people will do that kind of thing. So there seems to me a strong evolutionary link between the retributive feeling of inflicting punishment with the consequentialist justification of punishment. I don't know if you have something to say about this.
I think I totally agree with you. I would just describe, say that in theory, the theory retributivism is usually presented as that this is that the merit or desert is the only consideration that should be considered when deciding whether and how much to punish someone. And so retributivism is also the thesis that consequences should play no role in the decision about how much to punish or on whether or not a person is to be punished. Now, I think in practice, people in ordinary thinking, we consider both desert and consequences. So my way to describe that, the terminology I use is to say that people accept that others usually deserve something when they do something good or bad, but that when deciding what's the best answer to give the person, we also consider consequences, what the consequences of our decision will be. So I want to say that the two things are together in the way we usually think, and I'm on board with this evolutionary idea, and in particular, I'm trying to articulate that in another paper. And in addition,
let me just add something. And even if we don't consciously think about the consequences, I think that even if we just have an impulse of revenge, for example, or an indignation that claims for justice without thinking about consequences, even this is, in evolutionary terms, it is motivated, it has a function, it has been selected by evolution because it has a consequentialist effect, it seems to me.
Yeah, I agree.
Right now, I'm gonna ask Santiago Amaya to ask his question.
Thank you for the talks. This is a question primarily to Marcelo, but not just to him. Because people have commented on this. So first of all, I'm glad that you brought the Greene and Cohen paper, which is a paper that, to my mind, let's say, has not aged very gracefully. So back in the beginning of 2000s, we thought that science can change a bunch of things about social institutions, and I think we'll be way more pessimistic about that these days. But I think one thing that you brought along, which I think is very interesting, is really to ask the question whether the folk are retributivists, whether we have good evidence of that sort of thing. And I think there's some evidence that could be a little bit more complicated. So Thomas has this argument saying some of the evidence for retributivism actually has a confound, that is, actually punishment communicates things. So there's a backward and forward-looking component to it, but not necessarily a retributive component. And I quite agree with that. But I'm wondering if part of the allure of retributivism has to do with a series of views that come from normative Anglo-American legal theory. So if I think about legal theory in Colombia, it doesn't seem quite as retributive as Anglo-American law. And I suspect that something similar might be the case in Brazil. And so that's one part of the question, whether you think that the law, and by these I don't mean the criminal law from the Anglo-American system, but the criminal law in Brazil has this retributive component. And I say retributive as opposed to a backward-looking component. So that's one question. And another question has to do with the sort of cases in which, I think there are a bunch of cases in which people that might be backward-looking but not retributivist. So there's the stuff about signaling that Thomas mentioned, but we have a bunch of other cases. So when there are crimes for which there are no direct victims, so people tend to be less retributivist and think more about the consequences of letting the crime pass. So you think about things that are wrongdoings, but they don't harm anyone directly, like when you're harming the environment. People get along and start talking about the consequences of punishing or the consequences of not punishing. Or situations in which people have done things under hard circumstances. So it's not clear whether there's the hurt or something, and people immediately revert to thinking about, again, the good consequences of not punishing or the bad consequences of letting the punishment go. I wonder if because I know you in your group you've been working on some of this stuff empirically, if you have any evidence for people thinking about along those sorts of lines with perhaps the Brazilian population. So it's about stuff about the folk in Brazil and folk belief as embodied in the Brazilian legal system. Thank you. And if not, it would be great to gather them. Let me just say that.
Okay, thank you, Santiago. These are very good questions about the legal aspects here in Brazil. I think Renato actually is the one that would have better information than that. My impression is that there's, I'm not sure in the law itself, but I think in certain documents I have already seen this idea explicitly that one of the goals of is rehabilitation, and I think this is something widespread, at least in certain circles. And about the Brazilian population, folk psychology on these issues, I did conduct a study that is not published yet, and I'm not sure it's going to be published, but I'm trying to publish it. And the results, I think, were, although the study was small, and this is one of the difficulties, but I think that there was clear evidence that people can keep their beliefs about whether or not someone that has done something, a crime, the person is blameworthy, the person is responsible, but they can change the amount of punishment they recommend depending on certain consequentialist considerations about the consequences of the options available. So in this experiment, there were 3 conditions. One of them said that what the person did, what's the legal punishment assigned to that kind of case, and ask the person, the participants, to say whether or not the person is responsible, whether or not the person is blameworthy, and how much punishment the person should receive. The free will inventory was used. The translation into the Portuguese that was validated here was used, and in a different condition, it was included in the description of the case that a group of experts had analyzed the case and concluded that a specific treatment would work very well for that case and would prevent the person from repeating the crime in the future with a very high probability. And people tended the reduction in the amount of punishment recommended in that case was very high. But it was very high in the case where people had to choose either to punish the person or to send the person to the treatment program. And there was also a third condition where both options were available. In that case, punishment was statistically significantly reduced too, but it was not as much as in the second condition. So when it seems that when people have the option to punish, they tend to think that is something to be done to some extent, even though on average there's a reduction, the punishment is still seen as something important. I interpret that as evidence that people think some retribution, not retributivism, is important, that people deserve something and they should get what they deserve, but that they are ready to think also about what the consequences of the different options are. So I think there's a great space for changing punishment practices, but people will need very convincing evidence that we have better ways of preventing crime and depending on the way we respond to criminals in order to support that kind of alternative policy. So I think that's the challenge, to convince people that, like in the experiment, that there's a high probability of getting better results from a different, less punitive practice. I think that's a very great challenge for those who think that punishment practices should be different. I'm not sure I answered all your questions, but
no, but that's great, and I would like to see your study, because we have some data that we're collecting now, and people evaluate how bad it was for a certain age and not to punish, and then they gave different ratings, and then we asked, why do you think it was that bad? And it's often considerations of desert are not primary. There's more considerations about, well, you're going to send a message that you are weak, that you're morally incompetent, that has other things, and not just considerations that have to do with fairness and with people's reserves. So I would very much like to see your stuff. Thanks a lot.
Can I just answer the question? Retributivist notions and reasons for punishment are never explicitly clear in our legal system, but they're always there. It's just, and in most other as well. So just to clarify, you will find sometimes in legal sentences and convictions, but you won't find in the legal system itself, right, explicitly. But of course it's there.
All right, so Gabriel now, the last question, right? Am I missing someone?
I mean, I don't know if Thomas raised his hand again or he had just kept his hand raised. But I mean, as far as Carolina was liberated, we have no temporal limitations anymore. We are just here for fun and debate. I have a lot of questions and I'm waiting patiently. So let's see. First of all, I want to also comment on what Renato said to Amaya. In the Brazilian Constitution, it's pretty clear that imprisonment cannot imply any sort of torture, inhuman treatment, or any degrading activity during we are in prison. So, I mean, in terms of the Constitution, looks like that. The 88 Constitution, I would say it's much more progressive than the folk jurisprudence we have, you know, more collective nowadays, sadly. Just a brief comment, just to, I mean, and as Renato said, I mean, I think the retributivists, the very traditional vengeance retributivists approach is always hidden there somehow. I mean, it's always masked and veiled. I think that's very important to be noticed. My questions go in one of my questions go in this direction, the one to Marcelo, but I have a absolutely different direction with Gilberto. But I also want to debate something with Marcelo that goes in the same direction with Gilberto. My first question with Marcelo is a very short one, but I don't know that if the answer will be long at the end, because it's, do you believe in punishment? Considering what we are discussing here, avoiding a strict vision of retributivism, do you believe in punishment? Do you believe that even if we cannot really re-educate and re-socialize people, I mean, the treatment that you have in prison has to be as good as possible? That's the first question. The second question is, I mean, you cited probably the views of Libet towards the end of his career, in the mind time and the considerations he does on morals, even quote the sermon on the Mount of Olives, and all these considerations, he always reestablished the possibility of the veto and blah blah blah. The question is the following. I mean, my interpretation maybe is different from yours, but maybe this discussion will come up tomorrow with Marcel. I mean, I think the Libet's experiment do not prove or disprove anything about the causal relevance of consciousness if you're not recording the subject in the moment that she or he receives the cueing, the instructions for doing the experiment. That's my point. And to Gilberto, I think, Gilberto, you gave us a very compelling argument about the non-necessity of strict determinism. But I mean, could we have forms of mitigated determinism? Could we have, for example, conjunctions between a lot of local probabilistic causal determinations that will imply, in a conjunction with an AND as a Boolean operator, that those multiple necessary conditions will imply a sort of in conjunction, obviously, a deterministic case for certain behaviors. So those are my questions. Thanks a lot.
Well, you said for certain behaviors. If we limit this assertion to some behaviors, okay. I admit that for some behaviors there may be a probability of one of the effect given the cause. But the problem with determinism is that it supposes that this applies to all events. So it doesn't recognize the possibility that for other events, for other behaviors, there is not this probability of one, that there may be a probability between 0 and 1.
Clarify, I could extend my hypothesis. My question is, of course, you have a compelling argument against a Panglossian or strict determinism, but what if we can have like a conjunction between a lot of local probabilities in all cases of behavior? You just don't dominate the variable, so you cannot see this logical conjunction between various instances of probabilistic combinations that together, taken as a conjunction, they imply a necessity.
They imply what?
A necessity.
A necessity.
A one event. For
But
always,
they always imply necessities.
I mean, together, the various instances, various occurrences of local probabilistic events together, they imply a fully determined consequence.
But are you supposing that they may imply necessity, or that they always imply necessity?
I mean, that's exactly what I'm trying to explore with you. I just trying to see how do you see this.
According to determinism, which is how it is called in general, the standard definition of determinism is strictly determinism. That a determinism that supposes that if a grain of dust falls on a certain piece of rock in a lonely planet, at that moment it was determined since the Big Bang that specific grain of dust would fall at exactly that moment, at exactly that place. So the question is to know if this absolute determinism, which is what the definition, the standard definition, as Marcelo taught me in his paper, the standard definition of determinism is this, then I think we should reject this conception of determinism. Now, of course, if you admit a relative determinism, probabilistic determinism, well, that's another concept. But the concept of determinism as it is standardly defined implies a total, a universal, strict determinism down to the smallest details of every phenomenon, of every event.
Right, maybe
You
Marcelo.
think that so you take that determinism is always strict determinism. I mean, you take it as a Panglossian and universal thesis.
I'm just accepting the standard definition of is given by the author that has written on this.
Yeah, I mean, this is the full-fledged version of determinism. You could have something like Stephen Hawking, for example, his way of thinking. in terms of possible worlds, non-realistic possible worlds, for example, things like that in physics. I mean, or if you are correct, so all the relativistic mechanics should have some problems. You know what I mean? The relativistic mechanics, Einstein should be wrong in order to your argument make sense. Because
But if Einstein is right, then Heisenberg is wrong. And the fact is that quantum mechanics is there, and it's indispensable to explain a huge lot of phenomena.
okay.
Well,
Should I go? Okay.
And to say that Einstein is wrong is not to say that Einstein's theory is wrong, because Einstein's theory must be very right in applying to a certain sector of reality,
Like a certain domain of the universe.
Of applications.
Okay, that's a great move. That's exactly what I was expecting. I will say, yeah, for those things that Einstein talked, we can assume determinism, but we cannot assume a global determinism. That's a great answer.
Thank you.
Well, thanks, Gabriel, for the questions. I don't believe in punishment. I don't, but my main concern here theoretically is how much of that could be plausibly supported within a whole society. So I think what I have been saying is mostly that's totally implausible. It's implausible that we'll implement something like that. And especially if we add further conditions that will be needed in order to implement something like that. We have difficulties for very basic other needs that people have, and I doubt that they would reserve a large part of the social money, so to speak, to make the lives of prisoners better. So that's I think that there are many cautions that we need in virtue of that, but I think it's a fact. And on limit, I'm on board with what many people have said, and I think I have given a small contribution in that literature as well, in thinking that liberty studies didn't show that we don't have free will, that there are limitations in the studies, that the assumptions about what free will means are not always very solid, and also the methodological questions and interpretation of the results, it's very complicated. And I think here I'm on board with what most people I think in this conference have already said and published, and I think the criticism is convincing in those points. So I don't think the studies are enough to show that we don't have free will.
Okay, before we end this section, do you want to say something, Thomas?
Yeah, I wanted to just ask something of Marcelo, not really a question. It's more of a thought about the literature, because I knew when you were speaking before me that there would be a fair amount of overlap, and indeed there was less than I thought, but like more than enough. But so something that I feel like hasn't been maybe explored as much. I mean, you were looking at the effect, the differential effect that punishment has on people, right? And some of the stuff you talked about earlier as a way of figuring out what might be the most effective way of changing parts of our punitive practices, right? But I'm also interested in the sort of individual differences that explain why I'm happy to abandon retributivism, even if it still has its claws in me, but I'm happy to disavow it. And other people in this chat that I just had, where it's think it's impossible, like it's crazy, it's insane that you would get rid of it. And so because then whatever that is, it's probably not going to be cultural. I mean, it might be culturally influenced, but you're going to find pockets of this everywhere. And then it'd be interesting to figure out because those are the people who are more likely to have the transition that Greene and Cohen talk about, if anyone's going to have it, right? And so then, yeah, so I guess what I'm really just saying it might be helpful if we had more data on the individual differences with these sorts of things. So Adam Feltz, who was a grad student when I was a grad student with Dalmila years ago, he's got the work on free will beliefs and personality differences. I'm surprised there isn't more of that. And I just wonder how much of that goes on in the background, because that would also be relevant. So you're talking about the science of punishment, and then how that should affect like whatever direction we go, the direction we go. But then there's also the piece that like, it's not enough to have the science of punishment. Even if you have that, like we have that dialed in, if you can't convince people, if you can't convince the public that this is the direction we should go, it's doomed, right? So it's a doomed enterprise. And so I think if we try to figure out how do we get society to do it, then I think it's too removed. But if you just think, well, what is it about particular individuals that makes them more or less likely to be retributivists or not, or more or less likely to give up dualism or not? And then that's part of what and that's actually part of what the talk on. I guess that's part of what I'm going to get at on Friday. I'm not so much the individual differences piece, but that's what I thought of when you were talking about the sort of latest science on the sort of basically the science of punishment. And I was thinking, yeah, we also need this other piece, which isn't just about what views people have about things. It's also what kinds of personalities are more or less inclined to go this way rather than another way. And so, for instance, I say not surprisingly, but like free will beliefs, retributivism seem to correlate with like authoritarianism, just to pick one example. I mean, we can find other ones. And then it seemed like that would be part of this project of yours and mine. So anyway, that was just like putting it out there. Like it might mean that we should include more individual difference measures when we do this research. I will say this, why I don't normally do it, because then you do it and then it's never going to be what you're going to talk about in the paper. And then you collected all this data and then it looks weird because you have to say you collected it and then you're not going to talk about it, but you'll put it in the supplement. It's not like it doesn't help, like it doesn't look great. And so there's an opportunity cost with even collecting it. And so like I often don't, but like I think we should probably be doing more of it for partly the reasons, at least what I was interpreting the reasons you were giving earlier. So anyway, so the talk, I of course, like I love the talks you did. It was a great talk, but I've been thinking about this, and then when your talk made me sort of just reminded me there's something that we should pay more attention to.
Thanks for the comments. It reminds me of some older studies that I don't remember exactly here, but that in different types of crimes, when people are given the choice to decide about how much to punish and for what reasons, some studies that are a little bit older than this new wave of literature on these issues, they suggest that there are differences also in when you vary from a single person judging a case where the crime is of a certain type, when you move to a different type of crime, maybe the person changes to a more consequentialist or to a more retributivist view. So I think that adds further complications to the whole picture. But I think we need somehow to understand better these things in order to see if the law can be changed and if our daily practices can change. But I think I'm not sure I stress this, but historically, even though I think the belief that people usually deserve something for what they do is a constant, I think there's great variability in during the history of humanity. So this is there might be something interesting there too. Why did we change from forms of punishment that were much more cruel and punitivist? I don't know what the right word would be, but we changed for ways that we tend to think as less severe, but even though there are problems that many people point out these days, that there are serious problems, but still we have moved and changed the way the responses are implemented. So who knows where else we could go? Maybe if you understand these processes, we'll have a clue about what new things we could have.
Awesome. The coolest. You're gonna.
So you there? That was, yeah, good. That's helpful.
All right. I think before we end this section here, I just want to read a last question from the Q&A. I just checked. It's someone in the audience, João Pedro Pereira Rodrigues, who is still in the audience. So I think in respect to him, I'm going to read this last question, which is to Gilberto Gomes. The question is, great talks. I would like to know your opinion on what, if we deal with determinism, not as a yes or no question, discrete, but as a continuum, which science can approach in tiny steps. In other words, we can say that a ball shot to the air will, in a deterministic fashion, fall to the ground. As a person with grit is almost 100% determined to be said. Unfortunately or fortunately, science isn't yet developed in order to determine more complex scenarios and behaviors, but can't we agree that it is moving forward toward it since its foundation?
Well, I don't think it's moving forward in that direction. I think that in the biological sciences and in the psychological sciences, there is each time the place for indeterminism, for relative indeterminism is being progressively recognized. I think that it's in the very essence of life and of mental activity, there is this question of random events. I think that life arises from the possibility of an interplay between determination and chance. Like the title of Jacques Monod's book from a few decades ago, Le hasard et la nécessité, chance and necessity, randomness and necessity. Life itself seems to come from this. For example, each organism tries to replicate itself, at least it replicates its genetic code, even if there is a recombination, there is a variation in sexual reproduction. But anyway, the genes are intended to be faithfully replicated, but there is always a certain degree of unpredictability in that. There's a certain degree of randomness, and this is what makes evolution possible. So if sometimes we hear people speaking about the biological machine. If biological organisms were really machines, there would be no evolution. So they are not machines, they are organisms. They always involve a certain degree of randomness, and this is what makes life evolve. So I think that, and the same may be said for mental life, for mental activity, for intellectual activity, for the development of science itself, of philosophy, of ideology, of culture in general, of art. So I think the element of randomness is essential, although it's not sufficient to explain everything, but I think it's an essential element. The hope that what seems to be random is just our ignorance, and that it's based on fundamental events that are strictly determined. I think this is just well, how could I say, just a speculation. It's I don't think there's any basis for that.
Gabriel, you are the head organizer. Do you want to
You know,
close
as I
officially?
said to you guys, if you want to open a beer and keep here, it's up to you. I mean, it's officially out, but we can keep, asking and responding. I mean, it's been a lot of fun. I mean, Gilberto, would you mind to turn on to share your screen again? I want to go to a specific point, or maybe we can do it by memory. But I want to discuss what is a sufficiently different internal condition that could make the things otherwise. Because I mean, it seems that you, even if you didn't quote Hume, that's very Humean. You're saying freedom is a man that is not in chains. I mean, that's almost literally what Hume said, because you kind of separate external and internal causes. So I want to explore that. I think this is a precious but dangerous intuition.
I didn't follow exactly all that you said, but here are the slides. Do you want to go to?
Yeah, the one that you say it could be otherwise if the internal situation was it's towards the middle. If the situation was sufficiently different. I mean, the same external situation, but sufficiently different.
Mm-hmm. Let me try to find it.
Yeah, it's rather the next ones. You see, he used conditions external to the decision-making system. So, and yeah, had been sufficiently different, she would have decided to do what otherwise.
The decision-making process had been sufficiently different, and why should it be sufficiently different? Many reasons could justify this. Many causes might cause this. Directly causes related to the upbringing of the person, to the moral values that she acquired in her upbringing, her nature, her biological nature also.
But a lot of possibilities as well that not necessarily apply free will. For example, if I was more deplected of ions, I would decide otherwise. If I was more tired, I would decide otherwise, because whenever those are internal to the decision-making system.
If you had drunk a
Yeah,
lot,
exactly. I'll do otherwise. So we have both causes that are not controllable by the holder of the decision-making system. The question is there any condition in the decision-making system that is self-controlled by the controller of the decision system? That's the question of free will in its traditional form. So that's exactly a very technical point I want to explore with you.
Yes, I think that even if the subject is drunk, for instance, so his evaluation of the situation will be changed. The functioning of this decision-making system will be different. but still he will be choosing among alternatives.
Okay.
So,
Okay. But would you have this in a, I mean, would you conceive this as in a continuum? Would you have more or less freedom depending not just on external situations, but also in internal situations? I mean, what I'm asking for is the type of thing that Adina approached with a more capacitarian view of responsibility. She went through a lot of different cases of pathological hindrances that some people have and the other people do not have. Do you think we can consider that decision-making systems could vary in so many ways and could have, I mean, people, for example, when you got what Joshua Greene suggests about hyperbolic discount, he shows that people, for example, people that have addictions or people they were raised in more violent environments, usually they tend to be much more than people that had, you know, better conditions, hyperbolic discounters. So I mean, how much we'll have a variation of degrees of
yeah,
inside the decision-making system.
I think there are levels of free will. I think I didn't have the time to explore this here, but I think there are levels of free will. I think that, uh, uh, for instance, for example, biologists speak of freedom in relation to even to unicellular organisms and to organisms in different levels of development. Of course, um, human freedom, I think, is more elaborate. It's a higher degree, especially when it involves conscious decision making, and but of course, even if it's conscious, if it's subject to a high compulsion, for example, in an addict person, uh, we should recognize a lower level of of free decision. I think of freedom in freedom of the will.
Thank
Gabriel, can I just jump in? I'm thinking
Yeah,
of this
please.
case that Adina Roskis, she explores in some of her papers, like deep brain stimulation, for instance. If you have something that changes this internal decision-making process in a way that actually diminishes the person's ability to decide otherwise. What I'm thinking is, of course, this decision-making process or anything that we do consciously or not, this internal system, so to say, it is realized in some material base. It must be somewhere in the brain or something. So this distinction here from external and internal, the circumstances and the decision-making process, it helps to maybe address differences in what's actually determining the decisions. But overall, they all fall prey of the same problem of determinism. I mean, they are determined in the very same way, right? It's also something realized in a material basis in the brain. You can, deep brain stimulate in some ways. You can use some, high technology to, tickle and change things here and there. So I don't know how this distinction actually opens a space for free will. It seems that it just changed the address of the problem. What do you think about that? I mean, that's something that I thought when you were talking.
The question is intended to
To
Gabriel.
you.
Ah,
To
for me.
you.
Excuse me. I thought it was intended to Gabriel.
Oh, maybe to both of you.
Could you repeat it?
Okay, I can repeat it. The thing is, you make that distinction between this internal decision-making processes and the what you call the circumstance, which is around environment or external forces, right? What I'm saying is, whatever is internal, it must be realized in some material medium, right? The brain, whatever. Something is going on in there, and if you have some techniques like deep brain stimulation that Dina Roskis explores in some of the papers, so you have something in the brain, and you send this electromagnetical disturbance, and you change like the decision-making process, for instance, or whatever determines the how it functions. It's also regulated by laws of mechanics or whatever. It's part of physics too. It's something in the brain. The internal system is not something over and above matter in some ethereal Edenic space. It's something that is in the brain somewhere. So when you make that distinction, what I'm thinking is you seem to be trying to open a space for free will, this internal decision-making process. And what I think is, well, this is regulated by the same natural laws that govern the world in general. So you're just changing the address of the problem. You're not actually showing a place where free will can emerge. You're just kind of showing another part of the world that's also regulated by all the laws of physics or whatever. And I don't know how this actually gives us anything to address the free will question, right? This distinction of internal and external forces.
I think this brain system in charge of decision making, it really is capable of free decisions because it considers alternatives. And although it takes into account external influences, the decisions are not a mere result of these external influences. There are inside processes also that determine the final result, the final decision. But it's still a brain process. So if you have an artificial interference there, if you if you insert electrodes into the regions that are responsible for this, and if you apply disturbing electrical currents that disturb the functioning of the system, of course, you can have a disturbance of the ability to decide to choose between alternatives, and you may have.
Is it okay? Here's the question: is it an internal disturbance or external? Is it part of the circumstance or part of the decision, the internal decision-making process? This sort of disturbance.
It depends. If you affect something that is outside what I have called the decision-making system, you are affecting the circumstances, even if they are internal to the brain, but not internal to the decision-making system. But if you affect something in the decision-making system, then it's internal. Then you're affecting the process itself of decision-making.
All right. Oh, and just one more thing. I'm sorry. It has to do with the probabilistic laws, or when you make the laws of nature probabilistic instead of deterministic in the full-fledged sense, right? Still, it seems like we can change those probabilities. So we are free to a certain degree. It's pretty much like, oh, now you can decide to do otherwise. Oh, but that's just 0.001 chance of actually doing something else. Actually, you have this huge percentage probability actually of doing X instead of non-X. is it free enough for you? I mean, freedom is just kind of, well,
No, that's what I said. The indeterminist element, the indeterminist share in the causality of these phenomena is just a necessary condition, but it's not sufficient. We must suppose that there is a decision-making system that is causally determined. It's not when you actively choose something, when you freely choose something, this is not a random event. That is not decided, that it may have an element of randomness there, but mostly it is decided, it's determined, but it's not determined merely by external circumstances. It's determined by internal factors of the decision-making system.
right. I just think that if you have any really random process, something really random, you could not have a fixed probability. It's pretty much like it could go, who knows how, right, and to which direction. If you can fix a probability of going one way or another, it seems that it's not really random. It's something.
I don't think so. I
governed.
think there are degrees of randomness. If you think
Okay.
about probability varying between 0 and 1, when it's 1, you have certainty. When it's 0, you have certainty also of the opposite result. And in between, you have different degrees of randomness. Total randomness would be 50%. But even if you have 60%, there's a greater chance that result A will occur instead of result B, but still there is a certain degree of randomness because degree effect B will occur in 40% of cases.
All right. Well, anyone else? You want to say something, Gabriel?
I think we can just stop.
Yeah, I think that's enough, right? I mean, we are really exploring too much of our EVTs here, right?
It would be really nice to do this again, not so tired.
Yeah. I mean, I had a bunch of questions to Marcelo, but I mean, he put up an inventory of new possibilities of his research. I mean, I hope we can really have the in-person meeting because that's the type of discussions we can have over a beer, you know. I see, yeah, I'm exploring this article, you know, it will take hours. So we resume tomorrow at 10 in the morning with Marcel Bras. It'll be a great talk, I'm sure.
Right.
And Renato will present Marcel, and we're going to have a great discussion.
All right. Thank you. Thank you all very much.
Bye.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Foi prazer, uma ótima tarde. Obrigado a todos.
Bom.
Thanks. Obrigado a todos.
Umas questões guardadas para o Gilberto também, mas a gente continua a conversa aí em outros momentos.